Good afternoon, everyone. Well, good morning to some of you, good evening to some others, depending on where you're joining us from. I know we have a lot of people from Europe. I have some colleagues from Hong Kong. I think Marcus might be here from South Africa. So we have people from literally all around the world. So thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bidisha Banerjee. I teach at the Education University of Hong Kong. And I'm working on this project with two wonderful colleagues who I'll introduce in a second, who many of you probably know already. Our project, as you know, is called Thanatic Ethics, the Circulation of Bodies in Migratory Spaces. I'll put a link to our website in the chat box in case you want to get more information. This is the first webinar we've put together, so we're organizing two webinar series. This is the first talk of the first series, so we have two more coming up in November and December, and then three more in next year, early next year. So please drop us an email if you are interested and want to be put on the mailing list. And check out our website and let us know if you'd like to be involved with the project in any way. Let me quickly introduce my collaborators. We have Dr. Judith Mizrahi Barak, who is Associate Professor at Paul Valéry University in Montpellier, France. And also Dr. Thomas Lacroix, who's a senior researcher at Maison Française, Oxford. I'll hand it over to Thomas to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, and maybe I'll stop sharing the screen. Thank you, guys. Thomas.
So thank you, Bidisha. So yeah, so I'm very, very pleased to introduce our first speaker for this webinar. And Antoine Pecoud is a professor of sociology at the University Paris 13. I don't know how to pronounce it. It really sounds weird, University Paris 13. But he's also a research associate at Sciences Po in Paris. And so Antoine is has a PhD from the University of Oxford. He initially worked on the Turkish entrepreneurs in Berlin, but then he had a position for a long time, for a few years, at the UNESCO's program of international migration. And then he became very famous for being a specialist of the role of international organizations in the shaping of governance of international migration. And he worked extensively on the role, more specifically, of IOM in this process. And then you, of course, have many other areas of expertise. But I won't take more time, and I will give you the floor for your presentation today. Thank you, Antoine.
Okay. Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you very much to all the organizers of the seminar for inviting me for this first session today. It's great to be online with so many people from all over the world. It's a very nice experience. So I'm going to present a paper that is part of a collective project I recently coordinated on migrant death. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you will all be able to see what I'm referring to. Okay, so let me just, there we go. Yes, so the ongoing project is this one, was published as a special issue in American Behavioral Scientist a few months ago, a special issue with quite a few researchers all working on migrant death. I can see that Karolina Kobylanski is with us online today. So hello, Karolina, and Karolina was one of the contributors to this special issue. So if you want to have some further reading after the seminar, that may be an option. And in case you don't have the time to read all the papers, I just want to draw your attention to the Border Criminologist blog, the Oxford-based Border Criminologist blog, in which we published a short summary, so to say, of all papers. It's ongoing, so you can see quite a few papers on border death. Again, one is by Karolina, who is with us today. So just a few observations to contextualize the collective dimension of this work. And so basically, the topic I would like to discuss this morning is not really about migrant death. It's about how we count and therefore how we represent migrant death. So perhaps I can make a few observations here. The first one is that perhaps it's worth making a distinction between analyzing migration dynamics per se, for example, migrant death, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, analyzing the way those migration realities are framed, presented, counted, discussed, represented in a kind of constructivist perspective by different actors, including by the media, by NGOs, by international organizations, and so on. So that's perhaps a key distinction, also because from a policy perspective, we all know that policy do not necessarily react to migration dynamics per se, they rather react to the representation or the perceptions of migration dynamics. So perhaps it's worth stressing that I'm not working on migrant death in themselves. I'm rather working on the way different actors perceive migrant death and the impact this may have on policy making. That's perhaps the first point. A second point is about numbers. We live in an evidence-based policy world, as you all know, in which numbers play a key role. And here I'm interested perhaps in the way numbers can be very ambivalent. They can prove many different things. They can be used to showcase different aspects of reality. And when I will discuss this issue of counting migrant death, I think in the background we have this, this context in which policies claim to be evidence-based, and therefore numbers can be extremely significant, both to legitimize but also to criticize immigration policy and any other kind of policy, of course. So that is perhaps the second observation, is actually to take the evidence-based seriously and to say, well, okay, what kind of data do we have? Where does the data come from? Who counts the data? And to what extent is the data? How is it constructed? As we will see, statistics are never neutral, obviously. They always rely on a specific way of understanding reality, and therefore numbers can be interpreted in very different ways. And perhaps the third point, the preliminary remark I would like to make, is about the politicization of migration. As you all know, even though you come from all over the world, I guess many of you have heard about the ongoing migrant and refugee crisis in the Euro-Mediterranean region. This has contributed to highly politicized migration. It was already heavily politicized before, of course, but it was even further politicized. It became really an issue for high politics. And the question I would like to ask is, how do we play with this idea of politicization of migration? Namely, the fact that some issues become heavily politicized, but on the other hand, the assumption in this paper is that politicization also leads to its counter dynamic, a depoliticization of data and of migration. And so we have to study the interplay of what is politicized, what is deemed politically relevant, and what is depoliticized, what is sort of made technical or apolitical. So this is the kind of ongoing work that I try that constitutes the background of this presentation this morning. All right. Okay. So perhaps the starting point. The few starting point of the study. Why I should of course add. I'm sorry I haven't done this before, but the paper I wrote for this special issue was jointly written by my colleague and co-writer Charles Heller. You can see it here. I don't think he's with us today, but of course it's a joint paper by Charles and myself. So I will not only speak about my own work, but also about the work of Charles, who is one of the leading researcher and also activist on this topic of migrant death, at least in the Euro-Mediterranean context. So why did Charles Heller Charles Heller and myself start to work on this? Of course, like all of you, I guess, we went through countless media reports like this one, You probably all saw this, that's from the New York Times, but you could probably find thousands of similar articles in which global media talked at length about migrant death in the Mediterranean Sea and systematically relied on numbers, arguing, well, no, this year was more deadly than last year. There was a peak in terms of death in August or whatever. So constantly, being exposed, not only as researchers, but also as citizens and simply, people who read the media every day, constantly being exposed to numbers, figures, facts about migrant death. And so we thought, well, it could be interesting to look at where do these numbers come from and how are they produced? Because obviously it's extremely difficult at first sight to count the number of migrant deaths. Probably won't have time to go into the details, but if you study migrant death, you know that they often take place far away from visible areas. They take place in the desert, for example, at the US-Mexico border, or they take place at high sea, and therefore it's very difficult to assess the exact numbers of death. But nevertheless, we were confronted as researchers and as citizens as countless, very specific, precise data. So we asked ourselves, how come we have this data? Where does it come from? Who counts? With what criteria? What methodology? And so on. And in the meantime, as Thomas just mentioned, I was also interested, that was another starting point of the research. I'm also interested in the work of the International Organization for Migration. I can briefly advertise the recent book I just published on this organization, which is now a UN agency, UN Migration Agency, as it is called, that works on basically, what it calls, better migration management or improved migration governance at the global level. And I've long been intrigued by the way international organization can work on such a highly politicized topic, and a topic that really divides states between sending countries, receiving countries, and so on. So I was quite interested. I've long been interested in the work of the IOM. If I'm not going to go into the details, we could have at least another session on this organization. But this was part of my interest in the topic, because at some point, let me see if I can. Why can I? Yes, because at some point IOM launched the Missing Migrants Project. This is the website from the IOM website, Missing Migrants Project, in which they started counting migrant death. This started, if I'm correct, in 2015 or 16. So 4, 5, 6 years ago, approximately. And it was very interesting to observe this because IOM started working on a very sensitive topic, migrant death. And IOM has a long history of a complex relationship to specifically Western, global North states. They are the main funders of IOM. They usually ask or use IOM as a kind of actor in externalizing migration control. IOM has been heavily criticized for ages by NGOs because it plays a role in, for example, reinforcing border control in the global South with money from the global North, for example. And therefore, IOM, when it started counting migrant death, I asked myself, how come they do this? How come they play with this extremely sensitive data? Because you can easily see migrant death as an outcome of migration control, obviously. And given that IOM is part of the migration control apparatus, how come do they both, on the one hand, reinforce migration control, and on the other hand, count the deaths that occur precisely because of reinforced migration control? So it gave, it made for a kind of research question. How does an international organization invest such a sensitive issue? Also because in the background, if you study international organizations, you know that very often they are what is sometimes called knowledge agencies or knowledge organizations. One of the primary role is to provide data deemed relevant and accurate that is used by researchers, by governments all over the world. Whatever the topic you work on, whether it's human rights, poverty, development, whatever, you'll end up working with World Bank data or UN data or whatever. So IOs have a very strong role in providing the data. And when a UN agency starts counting migrant death, we could assume that it would actually become the lead agency and the lead source of data on migrant death. So that was some of the sort of starting point we discussed. In terms of the analytical framework, I mean, we see statistics as inherently political. I think Foucault himself mentioned in one of his writings that there's a shared etymology between state and statistics. The two words actually share a same etymology. And statistics, to some extent, is the knowledge of the state, what the state knows about its own population. And of course, Foucault and Foucault followers have worked a lot on how knowledge, statistics, facts, figures, number enable governments to actually control their territory or their population. So we work from that basis, arguing that statistics enable governments to address social and political issues. But the corollary of this is that some issues are never taken into account because they're not counted. And to a large extent, this is the case with migrant death. Countries have a lot of data about immigration to their country. They know how many migrants arrived, and they estimate the number of regular, irregular migrants, and so on. But there's no state, national government data on migrant death. So no country has measured or counted the number of people who died trying to reach their territory. So that's a kind of dark hole in statistics. And therefore, when you want to disregard an issue, or when you want to actually silence an issue, the best thing to do is not to collect data. And it appears as something that does not happen. So we have this deep relationship between power and knowledge, and politics and statistics. And therefore, this was the kind of background of the paper. We're interested in understanding how, at some point, knowledge becomes produced on a sensitive topic, by whom, given that states that are the primary source of data and statistics for their country, states do not seem to play a role in those statistics about migrant death. So different reasons why we got interested in this. And so we asked ourselves, how did it all start? I mean, who had the first, who was the first actor to first have the idea of counting migrant death? And as far as we know, this was, let me just try to move to another. Yes, this was first initiated by an NGO called United for Intercultural Action. They started in 1993, so that's 27 years ago, a long time, in the early 90s. The context, of course, is important. The early 90s is an immediate post-Cold War period, and it's the beginning of the tough measures to fight irregular immigration throughout the world, both at the US-Mexico border, for example, and across Europe, especially with the East-West, in the East-West context. And at this early 90s, this NGO sort of invented, so to say, this practice of counting migrant death. So what they produced is a list of death, what they call list of deaths. So if you go on their website, you can actually download this list of death here, which you can see here. And what you get is, it's difficult to actually, here we go, sorry. So what you get is a kind of, Excel sheet, so to say, in which you have literally thousands of entries with all the migrant deaths they have collected. So the last one was April 2019, and you have about 36,000 documented deaths of refugees and migrants. It's only in Europe. This presentation will focus on Europe, but a similar presentation, I guess, could be made on other regions, especially the US-Mexico border. But that's I don't have the time and the knowledge to present everything. That's really for Europe. And basically, they framed this as Fortress Europe. Fortress Europe, as you may know, was a keyword throughout the 90s to refer to the way Europe was progressively closing itself to irregular migration through heightened patterns and policies of migration control. And they list basically the death. So you can see here, you've got the number, the name, the gender, the age, the region of origin, the reason why the migrant died, the source, and they collect this from a wide network of NGOs, local associations, media, and so on. And they collect all this information, piling up all the data for over the past 27 years. So that's an interesting attempt. You can see that this NGO started a long time ago, well before we started as academics working on this topic, and they actually started producing data. And what is important is that statistics never measure a pre-existing reality. They measure something, and by measuring this reality, they actually transform this reality into a specific issue. So to some extent, this is the question I'll go back to. the question is, to what extent do they contribute by counting to creating a phenomenon that is called migrant death or death at the borders? The different terms circulate. So that was one of the first, or as far as we know, the very first occurrence of counting migrant death in the European context. And a few years later, in the early 2000s, there was a well-known map that was first published initially by a leftist newspaper called Le Monde Diplomatique, whom some of you may know. A very famous map that was widely circulated. It was done in partnership with the network Migrant and our colleague Olivier Clochard and Philippe Rekasevich. Those two actually produced this map, in which they actually transformed the Excel sheet we just saw into a much more visual representation, in which you can literally see where death happens, how many deaths were, and you can have all kinds of data on, the color refers to the type of death, whether it's drowning, whether it's accidents, whether it's other sources, other reasons for dying. And the size of the circle obviously refers to the number of people in specific places around Europe. And the novelty of this is that you could just juxtapose death at the border, literally, for example, between Spain and Morocco, and also death inside Europe, for example, in big cities, in airports or other places like this. I'll come back to this. That was the second sort of key step into this progressive construction of data on migrant death. And there are many other initiatives. I'm not going to go into the details, but with the crisis over the past years, quite a few other actors, some journalists, researchers, other NGOs started, in the same way, accumulating data on migrant death because it became a big issue. But the two first occurrences of this type of statistics are the two I just showed you: the United list and the map produced by colleagues and published in Le Monde Diplomatique. Obviously, what is interesting here is that we have a practice that was first established or invented by NGOs, and if we go back to the website, to the Missing Migrants, IOM Missing Migrant website, we see roughly the same type of practice. I mean, we see a map. We can actually go, if you want, you can play with the data, you can look at different areas and zoom on the map. It's global, it's not only Europe-centered, it's global, but roughly speaking, they have the same idea. They produce a map counting migrant death with roughly the same type of intention, showing how many people died where. And they actually also, I'm going to change, sorry, I have to change what I'm sharing. They also produced, you can, from their website, you can, if you want, download the list of data. So this is how it looks. It's an Excel sheet, which is accessible for free online from their website. And it's roughly the same idea than United. Basically, you have the number of people who died, the date, the location, the cause of the death, and so on. So IOM basically is doing exactly what NGOs have been doing for the past 25 years or so. Sort of building upon a practice that was established by NGOs and now that is performed by IOs. And of course, IOM has greater resources, and it does this in a much more sort of professional way, so to say, because they have greater resources. And there's evidence that they are progressively taking over. If you go through the media reports I just showed you at the beginning, you will see that very often the data comes from IOM. Actually, this data is becoming the most reliable and most widely quoted source of data on migrant death. But what's interesting is that this IOM initiative is not born out of nothing. It's born out of previous NGO initiatives. And actually, there's a lot of work on this. If you look at in political sciences, you've got interesting work. John Bowley, for example, an American political scientist, has this idea that to some extent, new policy issues are invented by civil society. For example, they take the issue of the environment, for example, invented by NGOs and civil society groups, and progressively the issue is taken over by international organizations, and then at the end, the first stage, that it goes at the level of states. So states, so to say, I mean, what states do is never invented by states or by governments. It's actually, on the long run, invented by civil society, then moved to IOs, and then to state. So if you look at issue like gender equality or environmental protection, you can see this sort of three-step movement. Now it's a big issue for many governments, but it used to be primarily an NGO issue or civil society issue, and it was legitimized, taken over by UN organizations, UN agencies, which actually then prompted states to take the initiative to work on those topics. So you can see this move from NGO practice, NGO initiatives, and then progressively through IOs, perhaps going to states. So we may be in the middle of the process. This practice of counting migrant death taken over by IOs like IOM, and perhaps on the long run this will become a state practice as well. So we have continuity to some extent, but we also have big differences. Let me go back to the web. Yes, so here, if you look at this this map and you want to zoom, for example, to a specific area, you say you're interested in Europe, you will click on Europe, and here you will learn that in 2020 to this year, you only have 69 deaths of migrants in Europe. So it's a bit strange because if you look at the data by NGOs, Europe is a big, important place in terms of migrant death, but IOM actually says, well, in Europe, it's no big deal. There are only a few dozens migrant deaths. So actually, they play with regions, they play with the geography. And by contrast, if you want to find information about the death in the Euro-Mediterranean region, you have to click on Mediterranean migrants in the Mediterranean Sea. And then you have actually many more. You have more than 700 migrant deaths. Most of them, as you can see, are in Northern Africa, Libya especially. But so the map is not, I mean, the distinction between the two maps is interesting. For example, on this map, which is about the Mediterranean Sea, you actually have migrant death occurring in Greece, for example. There's the circle with 33 deaths in Greece. And you don't really see the difference with this one, in which, there's the 47 here. That's the Balkan routes, I guess, but Greece somehow is put in the Mediterranean Sea. So they actually play with data, and this is precisely where the politics of data comes in. You actually position the death on the map, depending upon geopolitical factors. Roughly speaking, to make a long story short, what IOM does basically it says that migrant death is a southern problem, or it's a problem for sending or transit states. It's not a European problem, and therefore IOM is willing to help those transit states, for example, in Northern Africa or in Turkey, to address the issue of migrant death. So basically, it delocalizes migrant death. We talk a lot in migration studies about the externalization of migration control, sending states, receiving states, having to take over the job of controlling irregular migration. So here we have a kind of externalization of data on migrant death, moving the data from the heart of Europe to the periphery, so to say. So that's an interesting move. And precisely, I was talking initially about the politics of data. How can intergovernmental organization address such sensitive data? Well, one of the answers is actually by moving this data outside the global north, and therefore avoiding any kind of direct criticism of the responsibilities of receiving states in the heart of Europe. So that's one of the first big difference. And the second difference we can observe, I'll go back if I can to the list of death, which is quite interesting, and we're not going to roll down all the list because there are far too many, but perhaps if you can see on the screen, the second line here, it's a good example. You've got a young boy, Ali, 18 years old, from Afghanistan, who died in Geneva because he committed suicide in a shelter for unaccompanied migrants. So that's what United considers a migrant death. It's a suicide by a young minor immigrant because of bad housing conditions in Geneva. So here you have migrant death really occurring in the heart of Europe, in one of Europe's richest cities, Geneva, and it's the death that occurs following a suicide. And this is not at all what IOM counts. IOM completely excludes this type of death, and it counts only basically shipwrecks and or people who die in the desert in North Africa, for example. So the question this raises, which is a classical question with statistics, is the question of categories, right? If you want to count migrant death, first you have to define what a migrant death is. And right now, at this stage, there's no clear-cut definition. It's the same with everything. You know, if you want to count unemployment, you need to know exactly what unemployment means. And as we know, if you study labor sociology, you know that different definitions of unemployment, depending on how long you're unemployed and this type of factors. It's the same with migrant death. You have to create a category, meaningful statistical category, and decide what is inside the category and what is left outside. And so, roughly speaking, NGOs have an inclusive category. They consider, as they say, let me see if I can go back to this. Oh, sorry, no, it's this one. They consider here that all the people who are victims of the restrictive policies of Fortress Europe should be included. And so there are debates. For example, if you're an irregular migrant, you work on the black, you know, without a status, you're underprotected, and you work, so let's say, in the construction sector. You are badly protected. You don't have a helmet. You don't have, you know, the right protection because you're undocumented, and you have an accident and you die. Is this a consequence of restrictive policies or not? To some extent, yes, of course, because the reason why you work in such an underprotected way is because you're irregular. And the reason why you're irregular is because you have restrictive policies in Europe that ban people from a legal access to the territory and the labor market. So, of course, it's a migrant death, but is it border death? It's not quite clear. It depends where you put the border. IOM has a fairly, as we can see here, literal understanding or geopolitical understanding of the border. It counts people usually at the border. The 4 here is actually the channel, so the border between France and the UK. Whereas other maps, like if I can manage to go back to the other map, sorry, I keep struggling to move this. The other map, I'll make it. Apologize. Yes, this one has a much more inclusive understanding of the border, because it considers, for example, that if you die in Paris, basically it's many of the migrants who die in Paris actually die at the Charles de Gaulle airport, for example, because they're kept, either because they're expelled from the country in a brutal way and therefore they die, or because they have to stay in detention centers inside the airport. That's a completely different understanding of the border. A border is a kind of, you know, social border inside the country, a legal border as well. And of course, you can, depending on how you frame the border, and there are many ways of framing the border, as, you know, critical border studies have made clear, you actually reach a very different conclusion about what is migrant death. So you have this you know, playing with categories, playing with numbers, playing with the geography, and therefore what could be called depoliticizing the data on migration. So I'm not sure how many minutes do I still have. I've been talking for too long. No, is it still okay?
5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes. Okay, great. So I will conclude with those 5-10 minutes I have left. So perhaps the conclusion in more general terms is about what could be called the threatening nature of those deaths. I mean, if you study anthropology of death, for example, you know that in literally all societies, death somehow need to be taken care of. There are all kinds of rituals that enable societies to cope with death, especially a brutal or violent death. Have to be, you know, you have to make sense of those deaths, and this usually makes for all kinds of ceremonies to celebrate or to pay tribute to the people who died. So from that perspective, from this sort of anthropology of death perspective, migrant deaths are kind of difficult to deal with because very often they take place far away, at the border, at the periphery of the country. We don't know quite well whether it's our responsibility from Europe to the European side or others' responsibility. Usually states, of course, as you know, they blame the smugglers and the traffickers for those deaths. They completely disregard their own responsibility. And so we have those deaths that actually have a kind of in-between status. And to some extent, there's a big literature on this, obviously. Those dead people can sort of haunt, so to say, the societies, and you have somehow to make sense of this. And in this presentation, I tried to illustrate two ways of making sense of this. The first is the NGO civil society way, which count migrant death to, as you could understand, blame Fortress Europe and say basically to governments, well, you're responsible for this. You have to take into account those deaths, and you have to do something to prevent those deaths. So here, going back to the evidence-based issue I initially talked about, we have a way of using the evidence against the dominant political trend, because the data, the numbers are used not to legitimize policy, but to criticize policy. So it's a kind of sort of counter statistics, so to say. There's a book published by French sociologist, I can give you the reference after, which is called Statactivism, a contraction of statistics and activism. And that says that in some cases, activism, civil society initiatives can rely on numbers precisely because we live in a world dominated by a kind of neoliberal pattern of governmentality, in which numbers play a key role. So from that perspective, NGO use numbers as a way of contesting, making sense of these numbers as a way of contesting immigration policy, whereas IOM, so to say, is the counterpart to this. It uses those numbers, but to neutralize, so to say, the political threat or the social threat they represent. Basically, IOM argument is that, well, it's an issue for improved governance. We have to work with receiving states, with sending states, with transit states, and we have to help, especially states in the periphery of Europe, to address migrant death. And this better or improved cooperation or governance will actually enable a prevention or reduction of migrant death. So it's there's the same activity, counting, the same outcome. You have maps, you have Excel sheets with the list of death, but you have very different political intentions, very different realities that both play with this kind of threatening aspect of migrant death. And indeed, when you follow the news throughout the crisis, now things have a bit calmed down, but throughout the crisis, you had this idea that shipwrecks or migrant death were always sort of challenging, especially EU authorities or the Italian government, the Greek government, because every time a shipwreck would happen, it would actually urge the government to do something. And there's not much they could do, at least in the current context, unless they completely change the political framework, which is unlikely. And therefore, we have to make sense of those deaths and provide them with a meaning, a social or political meaning. And that's what both NGOs and IOs do, but with very different intentions. And this results into different categories, different ways of framing the geographical embeddedness of the death. Where does it happen? Who is responsible? What country is responsible, and so on. So very different ways of framing those deaths. And perhaps the open question I can conclude with is that the question is what will happen on the long run? If you follow this 3 steps move I just mentioned, the next step would be for governments to actually start producing their own data on this. Just like they produce data on other patterns of other types of death, for medical reasons, whatever, and so on. So they would actually start producing their own data, but with what categories, with what implications? And so perhaps the next step is what will become the dominant pattern of counting, defining, and apprehending migrant death? What will be the dominant way of producing knowledge on this? And depending on the pattern of knowledge that is selected, of course, you have very different implications, social and political implications. So I think I'm going to conclude here with this open questions. I have no answer about what's going to happen, but I think it's very interesting to observe how an issue became an issue on the long run over the past 3 decades, and how this issue is still being, because of this heavily its heavily contested nature, it's still being negotiated and renegotiated by different actors that intervene on this issue with very different intentions and therefore with very different ways of treating, addressing, apprehending or constructing the topic. Okay, thanks. I think I will stop here, and I'm happy to discuss some of the points I've been raising. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Antoine. It's a wonderful talk and showing how deciding who is a migrant death and where it's happening, it has become a political issue. It's amazing. And yeah, you really make your point saying that IOM wants to occupy the space, wants to become the legitimate voice on this issue. And it's not even statistics. If I remember well, the missing migrant is also the name of a project run by NGOs as well, or a journalist NGO, I think. So
yes.
IOM deliberately chose this name to replace something which was ongoing already. So
yes, no, there's clearly a matter of legitimacy here, and because the issue is very simple. If you let NGOs produce the data, they will become the dominant actor, and they will impose their own critical understanding of this data. So you have to replace them by a kind of more neutralized, depoliticized data. There are many other initiatives could be interesting to perhaps to add, especially there's a big initiative by the Red Cross, the International Red Cross Committee, who is, has a long experience about disappearances and people who disappear in situations of conflict. They've been working on this also, and that's also very interesting. I haven't worked on this yet. But it's very interesting precisely because the Red Cross has this long-standing neutrality towards governments, and therefore they address the topic in an extremely neutral way, which is also a very interesting way of framing the topic.
Okay. So thank you very much. So I will open the floor to questions. So I suggest people who want to ask a question, just show me in the chat who wants to talk, and I will. And maybe Bidisha, you can, is that you opening or shutting off the microphones, or no? Who's in charge of the?
No, people are just managing their own microphones, but yeah, people can raise their hands. So Judith has raised her hand for a question.
Yes.
So, yeah, go.
Yes, thank you, Antoine. That was a wonderful talk, and it's wonderful to have it first, in fact, because it really sets the situation for the following, webinars. I have a question about the terminology, because we know that the words emigrants and immigrants have become less and less used, contrary to why the word migrant has become predominantly used. So, was there a moment when, in the public discourse, among the NGOs, etc., was there a moment when that shift actually occurred, and is it visible, in fact, when it occurred?
You mean the move from the establishment of migrants as the dominant category?
Yeah, the move from the words emigrant, immigrant to the word migrant.
Yes, well, I'm not sure about this, but I think to some extent that's also a result of statistics, a much older process, because of course governments have very different ways of calling the foreigners. I mean, some will call them foreign nationals, some would call them immigrants, some would call them guest workers. There are countless ways, depending on the status of those foreigners, of course. You have different ways of calling them. In the US, I think they use the term illegal aliens for irregular migrants, for example, which is yet another way of calling the people. As far as I know, the word migrants has become very popular as a kind of catch-all concept, which enables, especially IOs, the work here is done largely by the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA. They produce global statistics on migration, and therefore they need a category which became the migrant category to actually refer to migrant workers, foreign students, permanent immigrants in, for example, Australia or Canada, and so on. And I would say that immigrant and immigrant is not. I mean, these were also fairly artificial categories. We do not have I mean, some countries say foreign residing citizens, for example, for immigrants, and so on. So I think there are countless words used by governments for the purpose of national statistics. And whenever you try to move up and to have a kind of global picture, you need a much broader concept. And indeed, the concept of migrant is, at least to some extent, partly the result of this quest for a kind of global category in which we can put all the different foreigners we can think of. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, of course, it's very heavily politically
yes.
charged. And even if you take
yes.
the word refugee can mean one
yes.
thing and almost its opposite.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. No,
so
but when we were, the term migrant is very complex. When I was working at UNESCO, remember we had countries that say, well, we have no migrants. We have, for example, permanent settlers. Countries like Canada would say, well, we don't know the migrant category. We have people who arrive. They are either guest workers, temporary workers in the agriculture, or they are future Canadian citizens, but then we have no migrants. So don't talk about migrants to us. It doesn't make sense. So of course the concept itself is contested, and different countries have different ways historically, politically, to frame their own dynamics. And about migrant death, we talk about migrant death. There's also the word border death, death at the border. We could at least, I mean, the different words coexist, but IOM interestingly speak about missing migrants, which is yet another topic, which leaves open the idea of whether or not they are dead. And there's interesting work being done. There was a very nice paper in the special issue I referred to about how the concept of missing or disappearing is very central in many political contexts, especially, for example, in Latin America, with the people who disappeared because of the dictatorships. So they were never really called dead, they simply missing, disappeared. And there's big work done by the UN, for example, by human rights activists on disappearances. The extent to which you can apply this to migration could be very interesting. It's a very interesting venue for research. I mean, these are not people who didn't really die, they simply, because being called dead requires the government to acknowledge that you are dead, right? And this is something governments sometimes don't want to do. They don't want to acknowledge the death because it's their responsibility, or because they want to leave it open, so to say. And so therefore people are missing or disappeared. That's actually yet another way of framing this issue in terms of terminology.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carolina, you've got a question. Yeah, you get to
yes, thanks. Yes, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for organizing this seminar. I find, Antoine, your analysis of the IOM very convincing. But I would like you to come back to the way the IOM collects data. Do they do like United or like Gabriele Del Grande? That's my first quick question. And the second is if there's any relationship between their data gathering with the so-called official lists, and I'm thinking here, for example, of the one produced by the Commissioner Piscitelli in Italy, for instance. Thank you.
Yes, that's a good question. Actually, it's very difficult to understand how they count the death. So I haven't done interviews with IOM people, but colleagues, co-writers have done interviews with IOM people. So basically, they're not very clear about this. The thing is that they have a wide network of regional, local offices, and they work with all kinds of local partners, NGOs, press, associations, and that's how they claim to collect the data. But as far as I know, there's no standard way they work. They basically ask their local colleagues to work and collect the data. And people kind of know, it's a kind of bricolage, so to say. People locally gather data the way they can, sometimes relying on lists provided by NGOs, sometimes providing other types of data. So it's very unclear. And I think that, if you want to take statistics seriously, those statistics are, almost totally meaningless, because they simply sort of, pick up information here and there. And they have no resources to actually, carefully document every single death and check whether it was a migrant death or a border death or whatever. So I think those numbers have to be understood as simply, kind of artificial construction. But I think with such a topic, it's inevitable, because, as I said, the definition is so broad potentially that you never know what to put inside the category, and lots of people simply die without being noticed. So obviously, gathering this information will require huge efforts, huge resources, This is what the Red Cross would like to do, actually investigating specific cases, understanding what happened very specifically to one specific migrant. But IOM does not have the resources, it does not want to do that. I think largely it wants to occupy the space by providing its data, but from the making of the data is fairly unconvincing, I would say. But I guess this also applies to NGO data. I don't think you can really have accurate data, especially because, as I tried to say you have no specific precise categories. So it's very difficult to have precise data if you don't know exactly what you're talking about. And about the second question in relationship to other lists, actually, I know that you have more and more lists that have been produced, and more people and governments and associations and media groups that have produced their own data. But honestly, I don't really know how IOM relates to these different initiatives. They probably use it, but I don't think they would acknowledge that they use it. So it's a fairly in-between situation. That's my guess. But honestly, I don't know exactly how they relate or rely on competing lists, so to say, or local lists at the level of the country or of a specific region. Also because they have, as I said, something I perhaps did not stress enough, they have a worldwide perspective, even though they acknowledge that this was largely a reaction to the EU Mediterranean crisis, but nevertheless, they try to have a worldwide perspective. And obviously the resources you have to work on this, Indonesia, for example, not the same that the ones you have in the US-Mexico border or the one you have in Greece. So they try to actually produce global data out of countless, very different local situations. But that's actually the very nature of UN data or global data. It's always sort of producing global statistics out of situations that are hardly comparable on the ground, because they come from very different contexts and very different countries and so on. So I'm sorry I cannot reply specifically to the question, but indeed that would be very interesting to look at the local manufacturing of this data at a country level or in a specific region. That would be quite interesting to look at.
Any other question? Yeah. Rashid Olalan.
Yes, okay. Thank you for your presentation, which I also found very interesting. I had basically one question, but I think you gave part of the answer just now with your comments. When the website and the project mentions the missing migrants, it means both people who are dead and the bodies were found, but also by the collaboration of people who disappeared in the sea, for example, and who are okay. So
yes.
Okay, so I understand the issue.
Yes, I think often, that's inevitable because you have, for example, testimonies. We have one survivor shipwreck that says there was 50 people on the boat and they were all died. Of course, the bodies will never be found, but the survivor will tell about this, and the data will be based on what the survivor tells. But indeed, you have other sources that look only at those that were the corpses that were identified, and they reach much lower figures, obviously, because most people simply they disappear, so to say. They die, but without disappearing, rather.
Okay, thanks. So I had one question I found very interesting, the 3-step moves you mentioned, from the civil society to international organization and states. So my question was, is there some places in the world now where this move has reached some states where we can start to check what's happening there? Or, is there some place?
Not that I know. Not that I know. I think this is the kind of things that take a lot of time. So I'm not sure. If you look at the history, for example, environmental concerns, it started like in the late 40s in civil society, but it took 50 years to become really a full state field of policy. So I think this will take time. But as far as I know, no, I haven't seen any. And of course, the problem is that the definition is not yet finalized. And I guess they still have a lot of work and bargaining, discussion, negotiation between actors to reach a kind of shared concept, definition that could be used. So no, this may also never happen. It's simply, if you look at other issues, you may perhaps conclude that this may happen, but it could also never happen. Of course, it's simply a guess.
Okay, thank you. Any other question, reaction? Okay. Apparently no. So, Judy, if you wanted to say a word to conclude the.
I just wanted to announce maybe the the rest. I mean, the following seminars and webinars, and say that we are really trying to build a network again. I mean, we've been used to doing that with Thomas. I mean, there was the diaspora network and then the ecotones network. So we've been working together for several years now. And so these webinars, in fact, give quite a new dimension. So as Susan was saying on the private chat, I mean, this is definitely the upside of the lockdown. I'm slowly getting reconciled with the whole idea of the webinars. I was very much against it at the beginning. And now I can see some of the positive points and positive effects. We are still thinking of those webinars as we are waiting for the real thing. But it started off, I mean, in such a dynamic and energizing way that maybe those webinars are going to to become a regular thing. So we'll see how it develops. It would be nice also for you to let us know whether you want to be associated with the program and not only with the webinars. So the next, in fact, speaking only of the webinar, I mean, the next one is going to happen on the 20th of November. And so we've been trying to associate, I mean, social sciences and humanities. So next one is going to be Srilata Ravi. So this is going to be a more literary one, but of course, it's not literature only, as we all know. And in the same way, just as the question on terminology also was pointing out, we can't, leave social sciences alone, obviously. So there is a lot of, interaction. So we're looking forward to that. And Bidisha, you probably want to also say something about the, or did you say something already about the time?
The time, yes. So apologies, there was some confusion today. I think a few people signed on earlier because there was a bit of confusion about the GMT, which many people took to mean UK time. But of course, Britain is now on summertime until next Sunday. So there is a 1 hour difference, but there won't be a difference for our upcoming webinars because GMT and UK time will be the same. So for those of you in the UK, just kind of heads up about that. Apologies for the confusion. So we look forward to seeing you at the upcoming seminar. And thank you so much for joining us. Any final comments or questions or thoughts? Thank you so much, Antoine. That was really interesting.
Thanks to all of you.
And you may be interested to look into the publications as well about the the former networks that we were working on with Thomas. And there is I mean, a forthcoming publication out of the Ecotones, and Corinne Dubois, Marcus Arnold are co-editors, in fact. And so it's also on Borders and Ecotones, and it concentrates on the Indian Ocean this time. So some of you, I mean, you will see the publication being announced. It should be a couple of weeks. So this is also something to look forward to. So.
Hi, everyone. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Hello, Susan.
Hi, Susan. Hi.
Thank you enormously, Antoine and Judith. Excellent. Thank you so much. It was lovely to join you this morning, this afternoon, or whatever timescape you're in. No, really great. Thank you so much. Antoine, you're at Paris 13.
Yes,
are you?
It's now called
Yes, well,
Sorbonne
we're next
Paris
door.
Nord,
I'm at Paris 8.
Yes, so we're both in Seine-Saint-Denis.
That's it. And we have a European University project with the University of the Aegean on Lesbos. It's just starting this year.
Okay.
It will be interesting to talk together to see
yes,
what we
absolutely.
can do with the students.
Yeah.
And I was just talking with Judith. We've really got to get the master's students involved.
Yes, great,
The opportunity of these webinars is fantastic for our students. No, I'm very excited about it. I really am. If my reference to the work by Dirk Herder was, sorry, I was writing quickly, but Dirk was one of our visiting professors at Paris 8 some many years ago, but he's still a frequent visitor to Paris, less so these days, but he's in the migration group at Condorcet. Does that ring any bells with you?
Yes, of course. Yes.
I think we can, I think, you know, we can do lots of things together.
Yes, no, with pleasure.
It's a happy circumstance, these online meetings. It really is. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, it's a positive side of the lockdown, absolutely, as you said.
Yeah.
I think Marois had a question.
Yeah, I think.
Come on, raise your hand.
I'm raising my hand. I couldn't find the button. So. Okay. Good morning, everyone. So thanks for this great presentation. So I'm a PhD student actually working with Dr. Misrahi Barak and part of the IMA department and recently DEAR department in La Réunion. I found the presentation quite outstanding, honestly, and it's a question that is currently, it is always raised, and some questions could not be, of course, given any answers, but we keep trying. So you've ended the presentation by talking about the rituals of death and the ceremonies, and I was a bit concerned because, of course, most of the bodies were disappeared on board or on the sea, but for the bodies resting, is there any particular policies or respect, or I would say not respect, but the government, are there any restricted policies or treatment particular from one country to another? It depends on the nationality of this immigrant or the country from which he or she came from. Are there any differences when they treat the
well,
body?
when it comes to actually, I think when you talk about rituals, I mean, there are all kinds of rituals. I was referring to rather to a kind of social political ritual in which you give a meaning to death at the sort of the political level, just like you would give a meaning, for example, to victims of terrorism. You give them a specific political meaning as victims of something, you know. So that's a kind of meta ritual, so the way a sort of national political ritual. At the local level, I think Carolina has written a great paper on this, so I think she would be much better positioned than me to answer this question. But I don't think there's any kind of national policy in any government to address this issue. It's really a kind of ad hoc local actors coping with the situation. And there we have actually a few papers from Morocco, from Tunisia, in the special issue that actually deal with this. You know, what kind of cemetery do you use to bury those bodies? Who takes care of that? Is it the church, the local government, the mayor, a small association, whatever? So I don't think there's a kind of national policy on this in any country. It's really something that, again, goes with the lack of data. As long as governments do not recognize that it exists, including from a statistical perspective, there's no specific sort of policy treatment of the issue, the only ad hoc measures. So yes, that's for practical rituals. I haven't really worked on this, but I don't think there are any. And there are very good papers, again, in this special issue on precisely on those rituals.
All right. Thank you. I was just curious about, because it's quite tough. We hear all the time stories about those migrants who lost on the sea or are dead, but their families couldn't recover them for years, or they couldn't know anything about them. So thank you for answering.
Thanks to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think the seminar is coming to an end now.
There's just, I think, someone asked for the raise the hand. I just saw this on the.
There was someone else.
It's Jucle. I don't know who Jucle is, but someone asked the floor. I don't know.
Sorry, I can't see.
Actually, my name is Juliette Clousiou.
Oh,
yeah, I don't know why my name is not written in full letters. I don't know what I did when I registered on Zoom the first time. Apologies for that. I just wanted a quick question. Actually, my question was supposed to rebound on the last question we had by Rashid, I think. It was about, first, thank you, Antoine, for your presentation. It was really interesting. I just, about your three-step processes or theoretical process, I imagine for this counting migrant deaths project, I was wondering how NGOs such as United, for example, or maybe the Red Cross or ICRC, position themselves now that IOM is trying to occupy the space in a very depoliticized way. Well, it was a bit of diverging.
Yes, that's a very good question. Well, I mean, the first thing to observe is that it's more difficult for them to get funding or to actually, keep their efforts on this topic, because to a large extent, the efforts are taken over by a much more powerful and resourceful organization. So, as far as I know, they have started sort of, working less on this topic. On the other hand, and this is something actually my co-author Charles has been working on a lot, on the way of how to repoliticize the data. And he has been involved in a research that actually uses the data to measure very precisely the death, the dynamics of migrant death across different borders and border spaces. And so, for example, using UNHCR IOM data and arguing that, well, given that we have this specific data, if we use it in a very specific way, we can prove things that blame governments for not intervening, for example. So using this data, arguing, well, if this data is reliable, then we sort of counter-use it to show that governments should have acted on this very specific shipwreck and this very specific day, and so on. So to some extent, I guess he would be the right person to answer the question, but in the last conclusion of our paper, we refer to his work in which he tries to sort of repoliticize the data, or actually, if you have reliable UN data on the topic, then you can actually use it to say, well, we have good data, so we can actually show things that before could not be demonstrated because we had, sort of weak, less legitimate NGO data. So it's actually different way of playing with data, basically. Not only connecting it, but using it, interpreting, going to the details, looking at the specific list provided by IOM, and using specific cases to show that nothing was done on this specific death, for example, this type of things. So I'm not sure it answers the question, but actually, it's in the
it does, and actually it refers to something that we will publish on the blog of one of the anthropological journal that you probably know, Terrain. We'll publish very soon. So it's a short blog paper, right? It's not an academic paper, but from a designer who's working on the use of these new of designers and number experts inside such arenas as international organizations, and how people who know how to create and visual data are used by the international organizations now as the new experts. So it might be interesting in this regard for you.
Yep. It raises big issues in terms, indeed, how you present the data and the skills, the kind of artistic skills you can have to showcase data, how this can be used also for political reasons, for sure. It's a dilemma
for themselves as
it can be a dilemma.
And obvious.
Yep. Thanks.
Yes. And just to mention that Juliette will be part of the webinar series next term, not this term, but next term. So you will tell us more about that. Is there anyone I'm missing? Can't see anyone willing to ask a question. No.
There are a couple of people expressing interest in the presentation and wanting to be in the webinar series and wanting to be kept in the loop. So please email Thomas if you haven't, and he will add you to the mailing list for the webinars. So thank you.
And actually, there would be. I mean, you can declare interest for the webinars, but also for the whole program.
Yes.
So if you're interested in the whole, program, and we're also looking into, developing it, I mean, further. So if you're interested, then you should send an email to the three of us, Thomas, Bidisha, and myself.